My 3 children stood in my living room, smirking as they slid a 4-page life agreement across my coffee table like they were doing me the biggest favor in the world. I signed it without reading a word, watching their faces light up with premature victory. What they didn't know was that I'd just handed them the rope they'd use to hang themselves. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me back up and tell you how I got to this moment, because trust me, you're going to want to hear every detail of what happened next. 7 days earlier, I'd buried my husband Robert after 42 years of marriage. Lung cancer took him despite his promises that he was too stubborn to die. The funeral was beautiful, I suppose. Half the town showed up, which is what happens in places like Millfield, where everyone knows everyone else's business better than their own. My children, Michael, Sarah, and David, played their parts perfectly. Grieving offspring, concerned about their poor widowed mother, making sure everyone saw how devoted they were. Michael even gave a speech about family being everything, which nearly made me laugh if I hadn't been so exhausted from 3 months of watching Robert waste away. Mom looks so lost, I heard Sarah whisper to her husband Brad during the reception. I'm worried about her living alone in that big house. That big house. The same house where Robert and I raised them, where Sarah learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where Michael brought his first girlfriend to dinner, where David studied for his SATs at the kitchen table. Suddenly it was too big, too much for poor old Mom to handle. The first hint of what was coming arrived 2 days after the funeral. Michael knocked on my door at 8 in the morning, carrying coffee and pastries from downtown. Sweet gesture, except Michael hadn't brought me coffee since he was 16 and needed to borrow the car. How are you holding up, Mom? He asked, settling into Robert's favorite armchair, like he belonged there. I'm managing, I said, which was true. I've been managing things my whole life. That's what I want to talk about, he said, leaning forward with that serious expression he inherited from his father. The managing part. We've been thinking, Sarah, David, and I, that maybe you shouldn't have to manage everything alone anymore. We. When my children started using we instead of I, it usually meant trouble. I appreciate the concern, but I'm perfectly capable. Of course you are, he interrupted smoothly. That's not what this is about. It's about family taking care of family. We want to help. There was that word again, help. In my experience, when children suddenly want to help their parents, they're usually helping themselves to something. What kind of help? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. Michael pulled out his phone and started reading from what looked like notes. We've been discussing the practical aspects of your situation. The house needs constant upkeep. The yard is enormous. You're dealing with Dad's estate, managing investments. It's a lot for one person. Your father and I managed just fine for 42 years, but Dad's gone now, he said gently. Too gently. And things change. We don't want you to struggle unnecessarily when there are solutions. Solutions. That was the second red flag. In my experience, when people start talking about solutions to problems you didn't know you had, they're usually creating problems to fit their preferred solutions. Sarah arrived that afternoon with a casserole and the same concerned expression Michael had worn. David showed up the next morning with groceries and identical talking points, all 3 of them suddenly very interested in my well-being, all asking the same careful questions about my plans, my finances, my ability to maintain the house. By the 4th day, I knew exactly what was happening. They'd coordinated this intervention like a military operation, taking turns to wear me down with their fake concern and helpful suggestions. What they didn't realize was that I'd been watching this particular dance unfold ever since Robert's diagnosis became terminal. I knew my children better than they knew themselves. The final act came on day 7. All 3 arrived together at 6 o'clock, dressed like they were attending a business meeting rather than visiting their recently widowed mother. Michael carried a briefcase, Sarah brought a bouquet of flowers that looked suspiciously like an apology, and David wore his most sincere smile. Mom, Michael began, setting his briefcase on the coffee table with the gravity of a judge approaching the bench. We need to have a serious conversation. And that's when they presented me with their masterpiece, the life agreement. 4 pages of legal-sounding nonsense that basically gave them control over every aspect of my existence while making it sound like they were saving me from myself. We've been thinking about your future, Sarah explained, her voice dripping with false sweetness, and we want to make sure you're protected and comfortable as you age. I almost laughed at the irony. They wanted to protect me from the same independence I'd used to protect them their entire lives. But I didn't laugh. Instead, I did something that caught them completely off guard. I signed it, just like that. No questions, no negotiations, no dramatic protests about my autonomy. I picked up the pen Michael had thoughtfully provided, flipped to the last page, and signed my name with the same flourish I'd used to sign their permission slips 30 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. They'd prepared for arguments, tears, maybe even legal resistance. They hadn't prepared for immediate capitulation from a woman who'd never capitulated to anything in her life. "That's wonderful," Michael finally managed, though he looked like a hunter who'd set a trap for a bear and caught a butterfly instead. "We're so relieved," Sarah added, though her eyes darted nervously between her brothers. "We know this is for the best." David just stared at me like I'd grown a second head. But here's what my loving children didn't know as they exchanged those smug little glances and started discussing implementation timeline. I hadn't just signed their precious agreement, I'd signed their death warrant, because while they were busy planning my life, I'd been busy planning their education, and class was about to begin. The morning after signing their little agreement, I called my lawyer, not the family lawyer, Robert's old golf buddy who'd probably run straight to Michael with everything I said, but my lawyer. The one I'd hired 6 months ago when Robert's condition worsened, and I started thinking about things my children apparently thought I was too simple to understand. "Eleanor Washington," I said when my call was answered. "I need to see you today. It's time to implement what we discussed." Eleanor had been recommended by my friend Janet, whose own children had tried to pull something similar after her husband's stroke. Unlike me, Janet hadn't seen it coming. By the time she realized what was happening, they'd already moved her into assisted living and were selling her house. Learning from Janet's mistakes had been an expensive education, but the tuition was about to pay dividends. "Are you certain you want to proceed?" Eleanor asked during our afternoon meeting. "Once we start this process, there's no backing down gracefully." I thought about Michael's smug face as he'd watched me sign that agreement. I thought about Sarah's fake concern and David's calculated kindness. I thought about 42 years of marriage, 3 children raised, countless sacrifices made, and the casual way they'd decided my life was now theirs to manage. "Oh, I'm certain," I said. "They want to play games? Let's play." Eleanor smiled, and I understood why Janet had recommended her. She was a woman who appreciated a good strategic comeback. The first part of our plan went into motion immediately. Eleanor filed papers establishing a revocable living trust, moving most of my assets into a structure my children knew nothing about. The house they thought was too much for me to handle, transferred to the trust, Robert's life insurance, redirected. The investments they were so eager to help me manage, protected. But that was just the foundation. The real masterpiece was the ranch. See, what my children had never bothered to learn was that Robert and I weren't just another old couple living modestly in small-town Kansas. 40 years ago, Robert's uncle died and left us 630 acres of prime agricultural land just outside Topeka. We'd been leasing it to local farmers ever since, collecting rent payments that we'd quietly invested in a portfolio none of our children knew existed. The ranch was worth roughly $2.8 million at current land value. The investment portfolio had grown to just over $3.2 million. Combined with the house, Robert's pension, and our other assets, I was looking at approximately $7 million in total wealth. My children, bless their calculating hearts, thought they were manipulating a woman living on Social Security and life insurance proceeds. The second part of our plan involved what Eleanor called performance art. For the next several weeks, I was going to play the role of the confused, overwhelmed widow my children expected me to be. I would ask for help with simple tasks, seem grateful for their guidance, and gradually let them believe they were successfully taking control. "Think of it as method acting," Eleanor explained. "Let them show you exactly who they are when they think they have all the power." The third part was my personal favorite, documentation. Every conversation, every decision they tried to make for me, every casual comment about my declining capabilities would be recorded. Eleanor had recommended a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a retired police detective who specialized in family financial exploitation cases. "Trust me," Eleanor said, "when this is over, you'll have enough evidence to write a book about elder abuse, or at least a very interesting lawsuit." That evening, Michael called to discuss the next steps in implementing our agreement. His voice carried a new note of authority that made my skin crawl. "Mom, we've been thinking about the house situation," he said. "It might be easier if you moved in with one of us while we get everything organized." "Organized how?" I asked, injecting just enough confusion into my voice to feed his assumptions. "Well, there are a lot of decisions to make about Dad's things, the house maintenance, your financial planning. It would be simpler if you weren't distracted by trying to manage everything yourself." Simpler for whom, I wondered. But I played my part. "I suppose that makes sense. Which of you were you thinking?" "Sarah has the most space," he said quickly, "and she's home during the day so she could keep an eye on things. As if I were a toddler who might stick my finger in an electrical socket if left unsupervised." "That's very thoughtful," I said. "When? This weekend maybe? No rush, but sooner is probably better. You know, before you get too attached to the routine of living alone." Too attached to my independence, he meant. Too comfortable making my own decisions before they could convince me I wasn't capable. "This weekend sounds perfect," I agreed. "Should I pack everything? Or just essentials for now?" "Just essentials," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "We'll take care of everything else gradually." They were planning to empty empty my house gradually, selling off 42 years of marriage piece by piece while convincing me it was for my own good. After ending the call, I poured myself a glass of the good wine Robert had been saving for a special occasion that never came, and I started making lists. Not packing lists, strategy lists, names, phone numbers, account information, legal procedures, all the weapons I'd need for the war my children had just declared. They thought they were dealing with a grieving widow who'd sign whatever they put in front of her. They had no idea they'd just handed control of their inheritance to a woman who'd spent 42 years managing everything behind the scenes while letting their father think he was in charge. Robert used to joke that I could run a Fortune 500 company if I put my mind to it. He never realized that I'd been running one all along. It was called our family, and the profit margins were about to take a very interesting turn. By Sunday, I'd be living under Sarah's roof, playing the grateful mother who needed to be managed. But I'd also be gathering intelligence, documenting their true intentions, and preparing for the moment when I'd reveal exactly how much they'd underestimated me. The game was starting, and I'd already made the first move. Moving in with Sarah felt like voluntarily walking into enemy territory, but I'd learned long ago that the best intelligence comes from behind enemy lines. Her house in suburban Kansas City was exactly what I'd expected. Everything designed for show, nothing built for comfort. "Mom, welcome to your new home," Sarah said, as Brad carried my single suitcase to the guest room. She'd emphasized the word home like she was doing me an enormous favor, which I suppose in her mind she was. The guest room was nice enough. Beige walls, generic furniture, the kind of space designed to make visitors feel temporary, which was exactly what I was, though I suspected Sarah saw this arrangement lasting much longer than I did. "It's perfect, sweetie," I said, sitting on the bed and looking appropriately overwhelmed. "I can't tell you how much this means to me." What it meant was that I now had front row seats to watch Sarah and Brad's daily routine, their phone conversations, their dinner table discussions about my future. What they didn't know was that I'd come equipped with Marcus Webb's special gift, a tiny recording device that looked exactly like the hearing aid I'd started wearing after Robert's funeral. "We want you to feel completely at home," Brad added, though his smile was the kind politicians use when shaking hands with constituents they'd rather avoid. "No schedule, no pressure, just family taking care of family." That phrase again, family taking care of family. If I heard it one more time, I might actually laugh out loud and ruin my carefully crafted performance. The first few days were educational. Sarah had apparently appointed herself as my case manager, scheduling everything from doctor's appointments to grocery runs like I was an invalid, rather than a woman who'd been managing households since before she was born. "Mom, I've made you an appointment with Dr. Peterson for Thursday," she announced over breakfast on Tuesday. "Just a general checkup to make sure you're handling the stress okay." Dr. Peterson, not my family doctor, who'd known me for 20 years and would have been puzzled by any sudden concerns about my mental state. Dr. Peterson, who happened to be Brad's golf partner and might be more willing to document whatever symptoms Sarah suggested I was experiencing. "That's thoughtful," I said, stirring my coffee with the confused expression I'd been perfecting. "Though I feel fine, maybe a little scattered, but that's normal for someone my age, isn't it?" Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with Brad. "Of course it's normal, Mom. We just want to establish a baseline, you know? Make sure we catch any changes early." Changes. There was that word again, loaded with implications about my declining mental capacity that apparently everyone could see except me. Wednesday brought the financial advisor meeting. Michael arrived looking official in his best suit, carrying a briefcase full of papers that needed my signature. David showed up with his laptop, prepared to walk me through the various accounts and investments they'd discovered in Robert's records. "Mom, we found some accounts that Dad never mentioned to us," David said, opening his laptop with the air of someone delivering important news. "There's quite a bit more money than we realized." I leaned forward with appropriate interest, though what I was really interested in was seeing how much of our financial picture they'd actually uncovered. The answer, it turned out, was depressingly little. They'd found Robert's 401k, his pension fund, the small savings account we'd used for monthly expenses, and the life insurance policy. Combined, they were looking at approximately $400,000, which they clearly thought was a fortune. What they hadn't found was the ranch, the investment portfolio, or any of the other assets Eleanor and I had carefully moved into the trust. That's wonderful," I said, injecting just enough surprise into my voice to make them believe I'd been as ignorant about our finances as they'd assumed. "Your father never talked about money with me. I just knew there was enough for bills and groceries." The look of pure satisfaction that passed between my sons was almost comical. Here was confirmation of every assumption they'd made about their poor, helpless mother, who'd never understood the first thing about financial planning. Michael opened his briefcase and pulled out a power of attorney document. "Mom, what we'd like to do is consolidate everything into accounts that are easier for you to understand. Simpler statements, automatic payments, that kind of thing. And to do that, David added, we need you to sign some papers giving us authority to make changes on your behalf. Just temporary, until everything's organized. Temporary. Like the guest room arrangement, like the helpful suggestions about my daily routine, like every other temporary measure that would somehow become permanent once they had legal control. That sounds complicated, I said, looking at the papers like they were written in hieroglyphics. That's exactly why we want to handle it for you, Michael assured me. You shouldn't have to worry about complicated financial decisions while you're grieving. While I was grieving, as if grief had somehow damaged my cognitive abilities along with my heart. I signed the papers, naturally, just like I'd signed their life agreement, with the same trusting smile and the same secret knowledge that they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating people. What they didn't know was that the accounts they were so eager to control contained exactly enough money to cover my basic living expenses for the next 6 months. Eleanor had insisted on leaving something for them to find, something that would feed their confidence while keeping them distracted from looking for anything else. There, I said, handing back their signed documents. I feel so much better knowing you boys are taking care of everything. The meeting ended with hugs and reassurances about how much easier my life was going to be now that I didn't have to worry about complicated things like managing my own money. That evening, after Sarah and Brad had gone to bed, I sat in the guest room and listened to the day's recordings through the tiny earpiece Marcus had provided. Every conversation, every aside, every moment when they thought I couldn't hear them. She's more confused than I expected, Sarah's voice whispered from the afternoon session. Did you see how she looked at those investment statements like she'd never seen them before? It's probably better this way, Brad had responded. Makes everything cleaner if she genuinely doesn't understand what she's signing. Cleaner, as if stealing from your mother was just a matter of proper paperwork and plausible deniability. But the most revealing moment had come after my sons left, when Sarah called someone I didn't recognize. Yes, she signed everything, Sarah had said. No problems at all. Actually, I think this is going to be easier than we thought. She seems genuinely grateful that we're helping. Helping. That word was starting to sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. I plugged my phone into Eleanor's secure communication app and sent her the audio files from the day. Within an hour, she'd responded with a single message. Perfect. Phase 2 is ready when you are. Phase 2 involved something my children hadn't counted on. Witnesses. Starting tomorrow, I was going to begin making some very interesting phone calls to very interesting people. People who knew exactly what healthy, capable 73-year-old women were supposed to sound like. People who might be very surprised to learn that I was supposedly confused and grateful and in need of management. The war was escalating, and my children still didn't even know they were fighting. Thursday's doctor's appointment was enlightening in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Dr. Peterson turned out to be exactly the kind of physician I'd hoped to avoid. Condescending, rushed, and apparently willing to document whatever concerns my daughter had planted in his mind. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, barely looking up from his chart as I settled into the examination chair. Sarah tells me you've been having some difficulties adjusting since your husband's passing. Difficulties. That was an interesting way to describe signing legal documents with full knowledge of what I was doing. I wouldn't call them difficulties, I said carefully. I'm grieving, certainly, but I'm managing fine. Dr. Peterson made a note, and I caught the phrase patient minimizing concerns written upside down in his surprisingly legible handwriting. She's been very forgetful, Sarah interjected from her chair by the window. Yesterday she couldn't remember where she put her medication, and this morning she asked me twice about the same appointment. This was news to me, since I'd deliberately left my blood pressure medication in clear view on the bathroom counter, and I'd mentioned the appointment once to test whether she was paying attention. Memory issues are common at your age. Mrs. Mitchell, Dr. Peterson said, finally looking at me with the kind of smile people reserve for children and invalids, especially after a significant loss. How would you say your concentration has been? I pretended to think about it, letting confusion cross my face. Sometimes I lose track of conversations, I said, which was true. I did lose track of conversations when I stopped listening to people who were trying to manipulate me. More note, more concerned looks between the doctor and my daughter. I'd like to run some cognitive assessments, Dr. Peterson said. Nothing invasive, just some simple tests to establish a baseline for your mental acuity. Baseline. There was that word again, the same one Sarah had used when arranging this appointment. They were building a paper trail, documenting my supposed decline for future reference. The tests were laughably simple. Count backwards from 100 by sevens. Remember 3 words. Identify the current president. I intentionally hesitated on the serial sevens, pretending to lose count once before finishing correctly, and I answered the date question after appearing to think about it longer than necessary. "Everything looks normal," Dr. Peterson said when we finished, though his tone suggested mild disappointment, perhaps slightly below average for processing speed, but well within normal range for someone experiencing grief. Slightly below average. I'd managed to ace his little tests while appearing just confused enough to support Sarah's narrative without actually failing anything that would require serious medical intervention. "But she should probably avoid making any major decisions for a while," Sarah said quickly. "You know, until the grief fog clears up." Grief fog. That was a new one. Dr. Peterson nodded gravely. "That's excellent advice. Mrs. Mitchell, I'd recommend letting your family handle complex matters while you focus on healing." I left the appointment with a clean bill of health that had somehow been translated into medical justification for treating me like an invalid. Sarah seemed satisfied with the visit, chattering about how helpful it was to have professional confirmation of what the family had already observed. What she didn't know was that I'd been recording the entire appointment, and that Dr. Peterson's casual willingness to support a narrative he hadn't actually investigated was going to make for very interesting listening when Eleanor reviewed the files. That afternoon brought a surprise visitor. My neighbor Janet stopped by with flowers and the kind of determined expression that usually meant trouble. "Helen," she said, settling into Sarah's living room like she owned the place, "we need to talk." Janet had been my friend for 30 years, ever since she'd moved to Millfield after her first divorce. She was blunt, observant, and completely unimpressed by social niceties when she thought something was wrong. "About what?" Sarah asked, though her voice carried a note of wariness that suggested she already suspected. "About the fact that everyone in town is talking about how you've moved your mother into your house because she can't take care of herself anymore," Janet said bluntly. "Which is odd, because Helen seemed perfectly capable of taking care of herself when I saw her last week." I felt a surge of gratitude mixed with panic. Janet was trying to help, but her intervention could derail my carefully orchestrated plan if she convinced Sarah I was more competent than I was pretending to be. "Janet," I said carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but the children are just helping me through a difficult time." "Difficult time, my foot," Janet snorted. "Helen, you organized your husband's entire funeral, managed the estate paperwork, and handled 3 months of medical appointments without missing a beat. Now suddenly, you need help remembering where you put your pills?" The room went very quiet. Sarah's face had gone pale, and I could practically see her mental wheels spinning as she tried to figure out how much Janet actually knew. "Everyone grieves differently," Sarah said stiffly, "and Mom has been struggling more than she's willing to admit." "Have you?" Janet asked me directly. "Because you seemed sharp as a tack when we talked about Robert's insurance settlement. Knew every detail, every dollar amount." That didn't sound like someone who was struggling with confusion. Insurance settlement. Sarah's head snapped around to look at me, and I realized Janet had just dropped information my daughter didn't know about. "What insurance settlement?" Sarah asked. "The one from Robert's employer," Janet said, looking surprised. "The additional life insurance policy they carried on long-term employees." Helen said it was a nice surprise, enough to make sure she wouldn't have to worry about— "Janet," I interrupted quickly, "I don't think we should burden Sarah with financial detail." But it was too late. Sarah's expression had shifted from confused to calculating, and I knew she was already planning to interrogate me about money I hadn't mentioned before. After Janet left, Sarah wasted no time in cornering me about the insurance settlement she'd just learned existed. "Mom, is there money you haven't told us about?" I let my face crumple slightly, as if I'd been caught in something embarrassing. "It's not that much," I said. "Just a little extra from Robert's work. I didn't want you children to worry about it." "How much is a little extra?" I pretended to think, letting confusion cloud my features again. "I'm not sure exactly. The lawyer has all the paperwork. Maybe 50,000? I get confused with all the numbers. 50,000. Just enough to seem significant without being large enough to change their fundamental assumptions about my financial situation. And of course, there was no additional insurance settlement. Eleanor had suggested I plant that story to see how quickly word would spread through the family network. "Mom," Sarah said, sitting down beside me with renewed patience, "this is exactly why we need to be involved in your finances. You can't keep track of everything yourself anymore. Can't keep track. As if I hadn't been managing our family's money for 42 years, while Robert took credit for every smart financial decision we'd ever made." That evening, I overheard Sarah on the phone with her brothers, describing the day's revelations with the excitement of someone who'd found unexpected treasure. She's been hiding money, Sarah was saying. Not intentionally, I think she genuinely forgot to mention it. But if there's 50,000 she forgot about, what else might be there? What else indeed? If they thought 50,000 was worth getting excited about, wait until they discovered what I'd actually been hiding. But that discovery was still weeks away. First, they needed to complete their transformation from concerned children to controlling manipulators. They needed to show me exactly who they really were when they thought they held all the cards. And I needed to finish documenting every single moment of their greed for the audience that would eventually judge them. Because this performance was just getting started. The transformation was remarkable to watch. Within 2 weeks of gaining what they thought was control over my finances, my children had morphed from concerned offspring into something that resembled a corporate board of directors running my life. Michael appointed himself CEO of my existence, calling twice daily to discuss administrative matters, like whether I needed new clothes or if my prescription medications required adjusting. Sarah became my social director, carefully managing my contact with friends and neighbors to ensure I wasn't overwhelmed by too much stimulation. David took charge of household management, deciding everything from what groceries I needed to which television programs were appropriate for my viewing. The most telling change was in how they talked to me versus how they talked about me. When addressing me directly, they maintained the fiction of respectful concern. When they thought I couldn't hear them, or when they were talking to their spouses, the mask slipped completely. "She's more pliable than I expected," I heard Sarah tell Brad during a phone conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. "Honestly, I think she's relieved not to have to make decisions anymore." Relieved. As if the woman who'd spent 4 decades making every important decision in our household while letting Robert think he was in charge had suddenly lost the ability to choose her own breakfast cereal. The financial control was exercised gradually, like a noose tightening by degrees. First, they moved my checking account to a bank where Michael was listed as co-signer for convenience. Then they consolidated my credit card, closing several accounts I'd maintained for years because they were unnecessarily complicated for someone in my situation. "Mom, we've simplified your banking," David announced proudly, presenting me with a folder containing my new financial setup. 1 checking account, 1 savings account, 1 credit card with a reasonable limit. Much easier to keep track of, much easier for them to monitor every dollar I spent, he meant. The credit card had a $500 monthly limit, barely enough to cover basic necessities, and all statements were sent directly to Michael's office for review. "What about the money from Robert's employer?" I asked, playing my role as the confused widow who couldn't quite remember financial details. "The insurance settlement Janet mentioned?" Michael exchanged glances with David before answering. "We're still working on that, Mom. There are some tax implications we need to research before we can make those funds available to you." Tax implications. Translation. They were trying to figure out how to access money that didn't actually exist while convincing me it was too complicated for my simple mind to understand. But the real revelation came during the family dinner Sarah hosted to celebrate my successful transition into their care. All 3 children attended with their spouses, along with my 2 teenage grandchildren, Emma and Jake, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the conversation flowing around them. "To Mom," Michael said, raising his glass in a toast that felt more like a victory lap than a celebration, "for trusting us to take care of everything." Trust. Such an interesting word choice from someone who was systematically dismantling my independence while convincing me it was for my own good. "We're so proud of how well you're adapting," Sarah added. "It takes courage to admit when you need help." Admit when you need help, as if I'd reached some moment of clarity about my own limitations rather than simply signing papers they'd put in front of me. But it was during the after-dinner conversation that I finally heard the truth I'd been waiting for. The adults had moved to the living room while Emma and Jake cleaned up in the kitchen, and with several glasses of wine loosening their tongues, my children finally dropped all pretense. "The Peterson evaluation was perfect," Sarah was saying. "Nothing actionable, but enough documentation to support our position if anyone questions the financial arrangements later. If anyone questions." As if they were expecting challenges to their authority and had already prepared their defense. "The power of attorney gives us everything we need," Michael added, "and she signed it so readily there's no question about coercion or undue influence." Undue influence. A legal term someone had obviously researched carefully before beginning this operation. "What about the house?" Brad asked. "That's where the real value is. We'll give it a few more months," David said. "Let her get settled into the routine here, maybe have another doctor's evaluation showing continued decline. Then we can suggest that maintaining the house is becoming too burdensome. too burdensome. The same house I'd maintained flawlessly for 42 years was suddenly going to become too challenging for me to handle. The beauty is that she genuinely seems grateful, Sarah laughed. Yesterday, she thanked me for helping her organize her pill case. Her pill case, like she hasn't been taking the same 3 medications for 10 years. Grateful. If they only knew what I was actually grateful for, they might have chosen their words more carefully. But the conversation that followed was the moment I'd been waiting for, the revelation that would justify everything I was about to do to them. Once we sell the house and liquidate the accounts, Michael said, we should clear about $400,000 after expenses, split 3 ways. That's enough to make a real difference. Brad and I could finally remodel the kitchen, Sarah said dreamily, and maybe take that European trip we've been talking about. I could pay off the boat, David added, maybe upgrade to something bigger. They were already spending my money, not just planning to inherit it someday, but actively dividing up assets they believed they already controlled. The house where I'd raised them, the savings Robert and I had accumulated through decades of careful planning, the insurance money I'd received after watching my husband die by inches. All of it was just numbers on their personal wish lists. But the final straw, the comment that would echo in my mind during everything that came next, came from Michael. The best part is that she'll never know the difference, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who thought he'd pulled off the perfect crime. She's so confused about money anyway. We could tell her the house sold for half what it's worth, and she'd just nod and thank us for handling it. Never know the difference. They thought they were dealing with a woman so diminished by grief and age that they could rob me blind while convincing me they were doing me favors. From the kitchen, I heard Emma's voice, quiet but clear. Are you guys really going to steal Grandma's house? The silence that followed was absolute. Then Sarah's voice, sharp and defensive. We're not stealing anything, Emma. We're managing Grandma's affairs because she can't do it herself anymore. She seems fine to me, Jake said, and I felt a surge of pride in my grandson. She helped me with my history homework yesterday, and she remembered stuff about World War II that wasn't even in my textbook. That's different, Michael said dismissively. Long-term memory versus day-to-day decision-making. You mean the decision-making that lets you spend her money on kitchen remodels and boats? Emma shot back. The argument that followed was brief and heated, ending with both teenagers being sent to their rooms and the adults agreeing to discuss family matters more privately in the future. More privately, because they'd realized that even their own children could see what they were doing for what it was. That night, lying in Sarah's guest bed, I reviewed the evening's recordings and made my final decision. The documentation phase was complete. I had enough evidence of their intentions, their methods, and their complete disregard for my actual well-being to justify what came next. It was time for phase 3. Tomorrow morning, I was going to start the process of teaching my children the most expensive lesson of their lives. And unlike their previous education, this one was going to cost them everything they thought they'd already stolen from me. Because while they'd been planning my future, I'd been planning their reckoning, and their education was about to begin. The next morning, I called Eleanor and spoke 4 words that changed everything. It's time to move. Within 2 hours, she arrived at Sarah's house with a briefcase, a notary public, and the kind of smile that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. Mrs. Mitchell, Eleanor said, as Sarah reluctantly led us into the dining room, I have some paperwork that requires your immediate attention. Sarah's face went pale. She'd clearly hoped to keep me away from lawyers until their control was more firmly established. What kind of paperwork? Mom doesn't usually handle legal matters without family present. Estate matters, Eleanor said crisply, pulling documents from her briefcase with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Time-sensitive issues that can't wait for family conferences. What happened next was a masterclass in legal precision. Eleanor presented me with a series of documents that I signed with the same trusting confusion my children had come to expect. The difference was that these papers were actually designed to protect me rather than exploit me. First, a revocation of the power of attorney my sons had convinced me to sign, replaced by a new arrangement naming Eleanor as my legal representative. Second, a competency evaluation request demanding that any questions about my mental capacity be resolved through proper medical and legal channels rather than the opinions of golf-playing doctors and manipulative children. Third, a formal notice that all financial decisions made on my behalf over the past 2 weeks were being reviewed for potential irregularities. What does this mean? Sarah asked, reading over the documents with growing alarm. It means, Eleanor explained with professional courtesy, that your mother has decided to take a more active role in managing her own affairs. The temporary arrangements you've established are being reconsidered. The word reconsidered hung in the air like a threat. Sarah immediately called Michael, who arrived within 30 minutes looking like a man whose carefully constructed plans were suddenly collapsing around him. Mom, what's going on? He demanded, barely glancing at Eleanor before focusing entirely on me. Why are you involving involving outside lawyers in family matters. Outside lawyers. As if the woman who'd been managing our family's interests while he was still learning to tie his shoes couldn't possibly be trusted to choose her own legal representation. I've been thinking about what you said, I told him, letting confusion creep into my voice again, about how complicated everything is. So I asked Eleanor to help me understand what I've been signing. The look that passed between Michael and Sarah was worth recording. Pure panic, barely disguised as concern. But we've already taken care of everything, Sarah said quickly. You don't need to worry about legal complications now. Actually, Eleanor interjected, Mrs. Mitchell has every right to understand the documents she signed and the implications of the financial arrangements you've established on her behalf. Financial arrangements. That phrase made Michael's eye twitch, and I knew he was calculating how much of their scheme might be legally questionable if examined by someone who actually understood elder law. Of course she has rights, he said, switching to his most reasonable tone. We're not trying to hide anything. We're just trying to protect her from unnecessary stress. Protect her from what? Specifically? Eleanor asked, and I could tell she was enjoying this conversation almost as much as I was. From having to deal with complex financial decisions while she's grieving, Sarah answered. From making mistakes that could jeopardize her security. I see, Eleanor said, making note. And who determined that Mrs. Mitchell was unable to make these decisions herself? The silence that followed was telling. They'd based their entire scheme on the assumption that grief and age automatically meant incompetence, without ever bothering to establish that assumption through proper medical or legal evaluation. It's obvious to anyone who spends time with her, Michael finally said. His patience clearly wearing thin. She's confused, forgetful, easily overwhelmed. Based on what evidence? Eleanor pressed. Based on living with her for 2 weeks, Sarah snapped. Based on watching her struggle with simple tasks and forget basic information. I'd like to hear about these struggles from Mrs. Mitchell herself, Eleanor said, turning to me with the kind of professional attention that made me feel like the competent adult I'd always been. Have you been having difficulty managing your daily affairs? This was my moment. The performance I'd been preparing for weeks. The role that would determine whether my children's education proceeded as planned or whether I'd have to settle for simply protecting myself from their scheme. I don't think so, I said carefully, looking between Eleanor and my children with appropriate confusion. I mean, Sarah says I am, but I feel like I've been managing fine. She thinks she's managing fine, Michael said quickly. But that's part of the problem. She doesn't recognize her own limitations. What limitations specifically? Eleanor asked me direct. I pretended to think about it, letting uncertainty cloud my features. Well, they say I forget things and that I get confused about money. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not seeing it myself. It was a perfect response. Just enough doubt to justify their concerns without actually admitting to any specific incidents of incompetence. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Mrs. Mitchell, would you be willing to undergo a comprehensive evaluation to determine your decision-making capacity? Something more thorough than Dr. Peterson's brief assessment? If it would help, I said, though I let my voice carry a note of worry. I don't want to be a burden on my children if I really can't take care of myself. The trap was set. My children could either agree to a proper competency evaluation, which I would pass with flying colors, or they could object and reveal that their entire scheme depended on avoiding professional scrutiny of my actual mental state. That seems unnecessary, Michael said after a long pause. We're not questioning Mom's legal capacity. We're just trying to help her through a difficult time. Then you won't object to having that capacity formally confirmed, Eleanor said smoothly. And there it was, the moment when they had to choose between supporting their narrative of my incompetence and avoiding the professional evaluation that would expose that narrative as fiction. Of course we support whatever Mom wants, Sarah said finally, though her voice carried all the enthusiasm of someone agreeing to root canal surgery. Excellent, Eleanor said, packing her documents with satisfaction. I'll arrange for the evaluation with Dr. Margaret Hayes, a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in capacity assessments. She should be able to see us within the week. After Eleanor left, the atmosphere in Sarah's house shifted dramatically. The pretense of caring concern evaporated, replaced by barely controlled anxiety about how badly their plans had just been disrupted. Mom, Michael said, sitting beside me with forced calm, I hope you understand what you've done. You've just invited strangers to judge your mental capacity based on a few hours of testing. Strangers, as if qualified medical professionals were less trustworthy than children with obvious financial motivations. Maybe that's for the best, I said quietly. If I really am as confused as you think, shouldn't that be documented properly? The question hung in the air like an accusation, because if I really was incompetent, they should be eager to have that incompetence professionally confirmed. Their reluctance to pursue proper evaluation revealed more about their true motives than any conversation I'd recorded. That evening, I overheard Sarah on the phone with someone I didn't recognize, her voice tight with frustration. The lawyer showed up out of nowhere, she was saying. Now they want a full psychiatric evaluation. We need to know what our options are if she passes. If she passes. Not when she fails, but if she passes. Because somewhere deep down, they knew I wasn't actually incompetent. They'd just been hoping no one would bother to verify their claims. What do you mean, Plan B? Sarah continued. We've already moved forward with the financial arrangements. If the evaluation shows she's competent, we could be in serious legal trouble. Legal trouble. Finally, someone was speaking honestly about the potential consequences of their action. The conversation that followed was muffled, but I caught enough to understand that my children had been receiving advice from someone with experience in elder financial exploitation. Someone who'd guided them through the process of establishing control over my assets while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives. Someone who was now telling them they might have moved too quickly and exposed themselves to charges that could result in criminal prosecution. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the muffled sounds of Sarah and Brad arguing about damage control, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced since Robert's funeral. My children had just learned that their victim was fighting back, and tomorrow they were going to discover that their fight was with someone who'd been planning this war much longer than they'd been planning their theft. The education was accelerating, and tuition was about to get much more expensive. Dr. Margaret Hayes turned out to be everything Eleanor had promised: thorough, professional, and utterly unimpressed by family drama. Her office was designed for comfort rather than intimidation, which made the comprehensive evaluation she conducted over 3 hours feel more like an interesting conversation than a medical examination. Mrs. Mitchell, she said as we finished the final battery of cognitive tests, I want to be absolutely clear about my finding. Michael and Sarah sat in the waiting room, where they'd been banished after attempting to influence the evaluation with their concerns about my recent behavior. Dr. Hayes had politely but firmly explained that family input would be collected separately to avoid contamination of the assessment process. Your cognitive function is not only normal for your age, Dr. Hayes continued, it's actually above average in several key areas. Your memory, reasoning ability, and decision-making capacity all fall well within the range I'd expect from someone with your educational background and life experience. Above average. I'd aced every test she'd given me, from complex mathematical calculations to detailed questions about current events, financial planning, and legal concepts. The supposed confusion my children had documented was nowhere to be found. What about the forgetfulness my family mentioned? I asked, maintaining my role as the concerned patient. Memory issues related to grief are normal and temporary, Dr. Hayes explained. They don't indicate cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. You're dealing with the largest emotional trauma most people experience, the loss of a life partner after 42 years. Some distraction and emotional overwhelm would be expected and healthy. So I'm competent to make my own decisions? Absolutely, she said firmly. In my professional opinion, you have full decision-making capacity and should be able to manage your own affairs without assistance, unless you choose to accept help for convenience rather than necessity. Choose to accept help. What a revolutionary concept in my current family dynamic. An hour later, Eleanor, Dr. Hayes, and I sat across from my children in a conference room at Eleanor's law office. The formal setting seemed to have sobered Michael and Sarah considerably, though they still maintained the pretense of concerned family members seeking the best outcome for their mother. The evaluation confirms what I suspected, Dr. Hayes began, reading from her official report. Mrs. Mitchell shows no signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or diminished capacity. She is fully competent to make financial, legal, and personal decisions. The silence that followed was deafening. Everything my children had built their scheme on had just been professionally demolished. But she's been so confused, Sarah protested weakly, forgetting things, seeming overwhelmed by simple decisions. Grief presents differently in different people, Dr. Hayes explained patiently. What you interpreted as confusion may have been emotional processing or temporary distraction. It doesn't indicate cognitive decline. Michael leaned forward, switching to his most reasonable voice. Doctor, we appreciate your assessment, but we live with her daily. We see behaviors you might not observe in a clinical setting, such as... The question hung in the air as Michael struggled to provide specific examples that wouldn't sound petty or manipulative under professional scrutiny. She signed documents without reading them carefully, he finally said. Did she understand what she was signing? Dr. Hayes asked. Well, yes, but then that's a personal choice about trust levels with family members, not a cognitive impairment, Dr. Hayes said firmly. Eleanor chose that moment to pull out her briefcase and begin the real show. Now that we've established Mrs. Mitchell's competency, she said, we need to address the financial arrangements that were made during the period when her family believed she was incapacitated. Financial arrangements. The phrase made both my children visibly tense. Over the past 2 weeks, Eleanor continued, consulting her notes, significant changes were made to Mrs. Mitchell's banking and financial management judgment without proper legal documentation of incapacity. She signed power of attorney documents, Michael said quickly. Documents that were obtained under potentially false pretenses, Eleanor replied. If Mrs. Mitchell signed those papers based on your representations that she was too confused to manage her own affairs, and medical evaluation now shows she was fully competent at the time, we have grounds to challenge every transaction made under that authority. The words hit my children like physical blows. Michael went pale. Sarah grabbed her purse like she was preparing to flee, and the tension in the room became thick enough to cut with a knife. We were acting in good faith, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. We genuinely believed Mom needed help. Based on what evidence? Eleanor asked, echoing the question she'd posed during our first confrontation. Based on our observations as her family, Michael said, though his confidence was clearly shaken. Observations that have been contradicted by professional evaluation, Eleanor pointed out, which raises questions about whether those observations were genuine or convenient. Convenient. The word hung in the air like an accusation. What exactly are you suggesting? Sarah demanded. Eleanor smiled, and I recognized the expression of a lawyer who was about to deliver a knockout punch. I'm suggesting that we review every financial transaction made under the disputed power of attorney. Every account closure, every fund transfer, every decision made on Mrs. Mitchell's behalf. And if any of those transactions benefited family members while disadvantaging Mrs. Mitchell, we'll be filing criminal charges for elder financial abuse. Criminal charges. The phrase that had been lurking beneath the surface of this entire confrontation finally emerged into the open. You can't be serious, Michael said, though his voice suggested he knew she was completely serious. Elder financial exploitation is a felony in Kansas, Eleanor explained conversationally. Penalties include fines, restitution, and potential prison time. The fact that the perpetrators are family members is considered an aggravating factor, not a mitigating one. I watched my children's faces as the reality of their situation finally sank in. They'd expected to face family disappointment if their scheme was discovered, maybe some angry conversations and temporary estrangement. They hadn't expected to face federal investigators and criminal prosecution. We haven't stolen anything, Sarah said desperately. We've been trying to help. Help by gaining control of assets you believed you would inherit? Eleanor asked. Help by making financial decisions that would benefit your own situations? Help by isolating Mrs. Mitchell from independent legal counsel until today. Each question was a surgical strike, exposing different aspects of their behavior that looked increasingly calculated when examined under legal scrutiny. Mrs. Mitchell, Dr. Hayes said, turning to me with professional courtesy, given your confirmed competency, what would you like to do about the arrangements your family has established? This was it. The moment I'd been building toward for weeks. The moment when I stopped playing the victim and revealed exactly how much control I'd never actually lost. I'd like to review everything, I said carefully. I want to understand what decisions were made and whether they were really in my best interest or just convenient for everyone else. Everything was about to become a very expensive word for my children to hear, because Eleanor and I were just getting started with their education, and the next lesson was going to teach them the true cost of underestimating the woman who'd raised them. The financial review that followed was like watching a carefully constructed house of lies collapse one room at a time. Eleanor had brought a forensic accountant named Marcus Chen, who examined every transaction my children had authorized during their 2 weeks of control with the thoroughness of an IRS audit. This is interesting, Marcus said, pulling up bank records on his laptop as we sat in Eleanor's conference room. The power of attorney was signed on a Monday, and by Wednesday, they'd already transferred $15,000 from Mrs. Mitchell's money market account to what appears to be a credit card payment. $15,000 to pay off debts that had nothing to do with my care or well-being. That was for Mom's benefit, Michael said quickly. We consolidated her credit cards to simplify her financial management. By paying off credit cards in your wife Jennifer's name? Marcus asked, consulting his detailed printout. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's face went from pale to red as he realized their financial sleight of hand was being exposed with professional precision. There must be some mistake, Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. No mistake, Marcus confirmed. 3 separate credit card payments totaling $18,000, all to accounts that belonged to family members, not Mrs. Mitchell. $18,000, nearly half of the money they discovered in Robert's accounts, used to pay off their personal debt while convincing me they were simplifying my finances. The really interesting pattern, Marcus continued, is the timing. These payments were made immediately after gaining financial control, suggesting they were planned rather than spontaneous decisions made for Mrs. Mitchell's benefit. Planned. That single word transformed their actions from misguided help into calculated theft, and everyone in the room knew it. Eleanor pulled out a legal pad and began making notes with the methodical precision of someone building a criminal case. Marcus, walk us through the other transactions. funds. What followed was a masterclass in financial exploitation disguised as family assistance. My children hadn't just paid off their debts with my money, they'd systematically redirected my financial resources to benefit themselves while maintaining the fiction that they were protecting me. Here we have a $5,000 transfer to David Mitchell's business account, Marcus said, labeled as Household Management Consulting Fee. Household Management Consulting. David had literally paid himself $5,000 for the privilege of controlling my finances, creating an official-sounding invoice for services I'd never requested. And this $3,000 payment to Sarah Bradley for residential care coordination, Marcus continued. $3,000 for letting me sleep in her guest room for 2 weeks while she monitored my every conversation and restricted my contact with the outside world. The total amount diverted from Mrs. Mitchell's accounts to family members over 2 weeks is $31,000, Marcus announced. Nearly 80% of the liquid assets they discovered. $31,000 in 2 weeks. If I'd actually been the confused, grateful widow they thought I was, they would have stolen nearly everything I had while convincing me they were doing me favors. These transactions constitute clear evidence of financial elder abuse, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd prosecuted these cases before. The pattern shows deliberate exploitation of a perceived vulnerable adult for personal financial gain. Michael finally found his voice, though it came out strangled with desperation. We were going to pay it back. These were temporary loans to help us stabilize our own situations so we could better care for Mom. Temporary loans. Without my knowledge, without my consent, without any documentation or repayment schedules. In other words, theft with a prettier name. Loans require the consent of the lender, Eleanor pointed out. Mrs. Mitchell, did you authorize any of these transactions? No, I said simply. I had no idea they were taking money for themselves. The admission fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of legal implications that would affect my children for years to come. I think we've heard enough, Eleanor said, beginning to pack her materials with satisfaction. Marcus, I'll need your complete analysis in written form for the criminal referral. Criminal referral, the phrase that made Sarah finally break down completely. Please, she said, tears streaming down her face. We can pay everything back, with interest. We never meant for it to go this far. How far did you mean for it to go? I asked quietly, speaking directly to my daughter for the first time since the meeting began. Sarah looked at me with the expression of someone who'd just realized she'd been caught in something much worse than a family disagreement. Mom, I know how this looks, but we genuinely thought we were helping. By stealing my money? By managing your affairs so you wouldn't have to worry about them, while helping yourselves to $31,000 in the process. Sarah's face crumpled as the reality of their situation finally hit her. They weren't just losing control of my finances, they were facing criminal charges that could destroy their reputations, their careers, and their freedom. Mrs. Mitchell, Eleanor said, turning to me with professional deference, you have several options for how to proceed. We can file criminal charges, pursue civil recovery, or negotiate a restitution agreement that avoids prosecution in exchange for full repayment and other consideration. Other consideration. I liked the sound of that phrase because I was just beginning to outline what those considerations might include. I need time to think, I said, playing my role as the thoughtful victim who was struggling with the decision of whether to destroy her own children's lives. Of course, Eleanor agreed. Take all the time you need. Meanwhile, we'll be securing your financial accounts and ensuring no further unauthorized transactions occur. As we left the meeting, my children looked like survivors of a natural disaster, shell-shocked, displaced, and beginning to understand that their old world had been permanently destroyed. But they hadn't seen anything yet, because while Eleanor and Marcus had been exposing the money they'd stolen, I'd been preparing to reveal the money they'd never known existed. The ranch, the investment portfolio, the carefully hidden assets that would transform this from a case of stealing from a modest widow into something much more significant. Phase 4 was about to begin, and my children were about to learn that their attempt to steal $400,000 had actually put them in line to lose access to nearly $7 million. The education was accelerating, and the final exam was going to be brutal. 3 days later, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Michael, Sarah, and David to meet me at the house, our family home that they'd been so eager to sell for my own good. When they arrived, they found me sitting in Robert's favorite chair with Eleanor, Marcus Chen, and a woman they didn't recognize. Mom, what's going on? Sarah asked, clearly nervous about the formal atmosphere I'd created. I've made some decisions about how to handle what you've done, I said, my voice carrying a firmness they hadn't heard since they were children being disciplined for lying. The woman they didn't recognize stepped forward with a professional smile. I'm Detective Lisa Rodriguez with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. I specialize in financial crimes against elderly victims. The color drained from all three of their faces simultaneously. A detective. This was no longer a family matter or even a civil dispute. It was a criminal investigation. Mrs. Mitchell has provided us with extensive documentation of financial exploitation, Detective Rodriguez continued, pulling out a thick folder that contained weeks of recorded conversations, bank records, and Marcus's forensic analysis. We want to cooperate, Michael said quickly, his voice pitched higher than usual. We've already agreed to pay back everything. Mr. Mitchell, Detective Rodriguez said calmly, financial elder abuse is a Class C felony in Kansas. The amount involved, the relationship between perpetrators and victim, and the systematic nature of the exploitation are all aggravating factors. This isn't something you can simply repay and walk away from. Systematic nature. That phrase hung in the air as the full weight of their situation became clear. This wasn't being treated as a family misunderstanding. It was being prosecuted as an organized criminal enterprise. However, Eleanor interjected, Mrs. Mitchell is willing to consider alternatives to criminal prosecution under certain very specific conditions. Certain conditions. My children's eyes lit up with desperate hope at the possibility of avoiding criminal charges, though they had no idea what those conditions would require. What kind of conditions? David asked. I stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the garden where I'd spent countless hours over the decades, building the life my children were now trying to dismember for profit. First, I said, turning back to face them, I want a complete accounting of not just what you took, but what you plan to take. Every conversation you had about my money, every scheme you developed, every assumption you made about my capabilities. Mom, Sarah started. I'm not finished, I said, my voice carrying an authority that silenced her immediately. Second, I want written apologies that acknowledge exactly what you did and why it was wrong. Not explanations about your good intentions, but admissions of theft and manipulation. The room was absolutely silent as they realized I was demanding they confess their crimes in writing. Third, I continued, I want you to understand exactly what you tried to steal from me. I nodded to Eleanor, who pulled out a legal folder that was much thicker than anything they'd seen before. Mrs. Mitchell, Eleanor said formally, would you like to explain to your children what their investigation of your finances failed to uncover? This was the moment I'd been planning for months. The revelation that would transform their theft from a family tragedy into a cosmic miscalculation. You found $400,000, I said calmly. Robert's 401k, his pension, the life insurance, our basic savings. You thought that was everything. Michael nodded warily, clearly wondering where this was leading. You were wrong, I said simply. Eleanor opened the folder and began pulling out documents that painted a very different picture of my financial situation. Property deeds, investment statements, trust documents, business partnerships, all showing assets my children had never dreamed existed. Your mother owns 630 acres of prime agricultural land outside Topeka, Eleanor announced. Current market value, approximately $2.8 million. The silence that followed was profound. My children stared at the property documents like they were written in a foreign language. She also maintains an investment portfolio that has been growing for 40 years, Eleanor continued, currently valued at approximately $3.2 million, $6 million. Added to the house and other assets they'd discovered, they were looking at a total estate worth nearly $7 million. But Mom, Sarah whispered, you said you were worried about money. You acted like Dad's death left you struggling. I never said I was struggling, I corrected her. You assumed I was struggling based on your belief that I was too simple to manage substantial wealth. The truth hit them like a physical blow. They hadn't been stealing from a confused widow with modest resources. They'd been attempting to exploit someone whose actual wealth dwarfed anything they'd imagined. Why didn't you tell us? Michael asked, his voice barely audible. Because I wanted to see what you would do when you thought I was vulnerable, I said. I wanted to know who my children really were when they thought they could take advantage of me without consequence. David was the first to understand the full implications. If we'd succeeded in taking control of your finances, you would have eventually discovered assets worth millions instead of thousands, I finished for him. And your theft would have escalated accordingly. Detective Rodriguez nodded approvingly. This revelation actually strengthens the criminal case significantly. It shows the exploitation was limited only by the perpetrator's knowledge of available assets, not by any moral boundaries. Limited only by their knowledge. In other words, they would have stolen as much as they could find, and the more they found, the more they would have taken. Here's what's going to happen, I said, returning to my chair with the decisive air of someone who'd spent weeks weeks planning this moment. You can choose criminal prosecution, where you'll face felony charges, possible prison time, and complete public humiliation. Or, Sarah asked desperately. Or you can accept my alternative, I said, which involves some very specific conditions that will ensure you never forget the lesson you've learned here. Eleanor pulled out another set of documents, these outlining an agreement that was both more generous and more punishing than simple criminal prosecution. Your mother is willing to drop criminal charges in exchange for the following, Eleanor announced. Full restitution of stolen funds plus 20% penalty. Public apology letters to be published in the Millfield newspaper acknowledging your attempted theft. Complete severance from any future inheritance or financial support. Complete severance. They would pay back everything they'd stolen, humiliate themselves publicly, and lose access to the very wealth they'd been trying to steal. And, I added, you will each contribute $50,000 to a scholarship fund for elderly financial abuse victims. Proving that you understand the harm you've caused extends beyond just our family. $150,000 total, plus restitution, plus public humiliation, plus permanent disinheritance. The cost of their greed was about to exceed any possible benefit they might have imagined. The alternative, Detective Rodriguez said helpfully, is criminal prosecution for systematic financial elder abuse, which carries potential sentences of up to 5 years in prison and permanent criminal records. My children sat in stunned silence, trying to process how quickly their lives had been transformed from comfortable success to potential ruin. You have 24 hours to decide, I said, standing up to signal the meeting was over. After that, the offer expires and Detective Rodriguez proceeds with criminal charges. As they filed out of the house they'd planned to sell out from under me, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced since Robert's death. My children had tried to steal my independence, my dignity, and my financial security while convincing themselves they were helping me. Tomorrow, they would learn that their education in consequences was just beginning. 23 hours later, all 3 of my children sat in Eleanor's office, signing the most expensive documents of their lives. Michael's hand shook as he wrote his name on the restitution agreement. Sarah cried openly while signing her public apology letter. David just stared at the scholarship fund commitment like he couldn't believe the numbers were real. The total financial impact to the 3 of you is $231,000, Eleanor announced as she notarized the final signature, plus the published admissions of attempted theft, plus permanent exclusion from Mrs. Mitchell's estate. $231,000. The price of trying to steal from someone they'd assumed was too old and confused to fight back, but the money was just the beginning of their education. There's one more thing, I said, as they prepared to leave Eleanor's office in disgrace. They turned back with the exhausted expressions of people who'd been broken by revelations and consequences they'd never seen coming. I'm not actually keeping your inheritance, I said quietly. The statement hit them like an electric shock. Sarah's tear-streaked face went blank with confusion. Michael stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language, and David's mouth opened without any sound coming out. You're what? Sarah finally managed. I said, I'm not keeping your inheritance. Despite everything you've done, you're still my children, and I still love you. Eleanor raised an eyebrow at me, though we'd discussed this possibility. The greatest punishment for people motivated by greed isn't losing money, it's learning they never needed to steal in the first place. But Mom, Michael said slowly, the agreement we just signed says you'll be excluded from my estate, I confirmed. It doesn't say that estate won't still benefit your children and grandchildren in ways that serve the family better than your individual greed ever could. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared for this moment, containing documents that outlined what I'd actually been planning while they were scheming to rob me. Emma and Jake will each receive full college scholarships from a trust I've established, I said, watching their faces as the implications sank in. Your grandchildren will be educated without the burden of student loans, but you won't control those funds. The ranch will become a family farm operation managed by a board of trustees, I continued, generating income for family members who contribute to its success through actual work, not manipulation and theft. And the house will become a family retreat center, available for family gatherings and maintained through the trust, ensuring it stays in the family without becoming a source of conflict. What I was describing was everything they could have asked for if they'd simply talked to me about their concerns instead of trying to steal from me. Financial security for their children, ongoing family wealth, preservation of family property, all structured to prevent the kind of exploitation they'd just attempted. Why? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because the point of this entire experience wasn't revenge, I said. It was education. You needed to learn what it felt like to be vulnerable to people you trusted. You needed to understand the real cost of betraying family, and you needed to discover that cooperation works better than exploitation. But we tried to steal from you, Sarah said, still crying. saying. Yes, you did, and you paid a very high price for that choice. But you're also my children, and children need to be taught, not just punished. Eleanor smiled as she watched the complex emotions play across their faces: shame, relief, gratitude, and the gradual understanding that their mother had been teaching them a lesson rather than simply seeking revenge. The trust documents include one final provision, I added. If any of you ever attempt to manipulate or financially exploit an elderly person again, your family's access to the trust ends permanently. This education is a one-time offer. It was a warning wrapped in forgiveness, a second chance balanced with permanent accountability. Mom, Michael said finally, how long have you been planning this? Since the day you started treating me like I was incompetent, I answered honestly. The moment you decided I was too old and confused to manage my own life, I began preparing to teach you exactly how capable I still am. We're so sorry, Sarah said, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, her apology sounded genuine rather than calculated. I know you are, I said, but sorry isn't enough anymore. From now on, our family relationships will be based on respect, honesty, and cooperation. Anyone who can't meet those standards will find themselves permanently excluded. As my children left Eleanor's office, financially devastated but still family, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. I'd protected myself, educated my children, and structured our family's future in a way that would prevent anyone from ever victimizing anyone else again. 3 months later, I stood in the community garden I'd established on a portion of the ranch property, watching Emma and Jake plant vegetables alongside their parent. The scholarship fund had grown beyond my initial contribution, helping dozens of elderly abuse victims while providing ongoing education for my family about the importance of protecting vulnerable people. Michael had taken a part-time job managing the ranch operations, learning agricultural business while rebuilding our relationship on terms of mutual respect. Sarah had become a volunteer advocate for elderly rights, channeling her organizational skills toward protecting others instead of exploiting them. David had used his business experience to establish the family retreat center, creating a space where future generations could gather without fighting over ownership. My published autobiography, Never Too Old to Fight Back, had become a bestseller among older women, providing both entertainment and practical advice for anyone facing family financial exploitation. The proceeds funded expansion of the scholarship program and helped establish similar support systems in communities across Kansas. But the most satisfying moment came during our first family reunion at the retreat center, when Emma approached me with a question that proved the education had worked. Grandma, she said, I want to major in elder law when I get to college. I want to help people like you who are smart enough to fight back, and people like Grandpa's sister who wasn't. Elder law. My granddaughter wanted to spend her life protecting people her own parents had tried to exploit. The lesson had been learned not just by my children, but by the next generation. That's a wonderful choice, sweetheart, I told her. And when you graduate, there will be a place for you in the family foundation we're establishing to fight elder abuse across the country. As I watched my family working together in the garden they'd helped plant, I realized that sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children isn't money or property. It's the education that teaches them to value people over profit, relationship over exploitation, and integrity over easy gain. My children had tried to steal my independence and discovered instead that I was strong enough to restructure their entire world while teaching them to become better people. It had been the most expensive education any of them ever received, but also the most valuable. And every time I looked at the ranch they'd never known about, the investments they'd never discovered, and the trust documents that would protect our family for generations, I remembered that sometimes the best defense against being underestimated is letting people underestimate you until the moment you teach them otherwise. The lesson was over. The learning would last forever. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.